followed by Nan Rubin, who is the Executive Director of the RSVP serving Addison and Rutland counties.
I'm not sure where you got Reuben from, but that's very interesting. My husband's favorite sandwich.
You must know. I'm so sorry.
That's cute.
And Nan Hart is with RSVP of and the Volunteer Center of Addison and Rutland. Am I right? Yeah. And so, without further ado, Monica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I am happy to be here and talk to you a little bit about measuring impact and sort of the way we do it at the United Way of Chittenden County, but also a way a lot of other organizations are doing it. And I hope it'll be useful information for you. So I just want to start out by sort of asking the question, what is measuring impact? Because I think people can have a really different answer of what they think that might mean when they're talking about measuring their impact and then talking about why it's so important. The first thing, if you read the sentence, it's systematic. So we know that you all probably evaluate a lot of your programs on a regular basis. You collect information and you look at it. But the idea of measuring impact is really doing it in a very systematic and purposeful way. You've designed it, you know when you're going to do it, and you're going to do it according to a timeline or a plan. And it's a process. It's not something that you do once and then you say, oh great, we evaluated our program and now we can move on from there. You need to do it over and over and over again, and it's a process that you will improve along the way. And it needs to be measurable, so you need to be able to find something somewhere that you can track and record over time. And that, I think, is something that's always a challenge for a lot of people, is finding that piece of information that's useful, that's reliable, and that's relevant that you can track over time. But once you do it, once you're able to get all of this in place, you're really going to reap a tremendous benefit, because you're going to be able to really talk about the work that you're doing, and you're going to be able to talk about it in a much more comprehensive and compelling way. So that's why we want to measure impact. So whenever we talk about evaluation or impact, we really need to be aware there's a distinction between talking about impact at a program level basis, which is probably what most of you are going to want to do, and then on a community level impact. And certainly at the program level, the real focus is we're talking about the well-being of your clients, the people or the community or the animals that you might be serving, and gathering that data to really demonstrate that you're doing what you say you're going to be doing for those people. On the community level, it's really talking about a larger picture of the whole population. And it's not for necessarily one individual program. So you as an individual program wouldn't be responsible for demonstrating the result of a community or a population. A good example is if you're running a preschool, for instance, you're going to measure how well the children in your preschool are doing at certain milestones, but you're not going to be able to say that you're taking responsibility for the overall readiness of the children in your community to go to kindergarten. Right? So there's sort of an appropriate accountability, what you want to say that you're responsible for within your programs. Does that make sense to all of you? And so today we're really going to be talking about the program level impact. I'll give you an example of community level impact a little bit later on, but we'll focus mostly on this top level. Just a little bit of history at the United Way of Chittenden County. So we've been evaluating and helping the member agencies of the United Way evaluate their program outcomes for over 10 years, and it's evolved for quite some time. And then the last few years we really shifted to this idea of community level impact, which is about what we say we're doing collectively. What's the impact of the United Way in the community and the work that we're doing? And it really is a combination of those two things. So my goal for today is to really to share with you what we've learned over these many years of working with our nonprofits, and then give you some ideas. But it's certainly not, my purpose is not to tell you or to get you to do it this way. It's just to give you an idea about how you might want to start doing it. There's plenty of really good methods and models out there for you to use. Okay, so we'll go to the program level impact, and really there's two purposes here. One purpose is you can do this so that you can improve your program. You're not just doing it because you're curious or you want to just go through an academic exercise or because your funders require it. Now, we know that a lot of your funders do require it. As a funder, I can say we really require that our agencies do that, and I think a lot of times, I heard some of you say in your introductions that you're writing grants and the evaluation piece is a really big part of the grant. You get scored on it. They want to know how well you're doing it. So it is important. But it does benefit you, and that's the important thing to talk about. And that's sort of the mindset that you need to have, is that there's a lot of things that you will get, you and your program staff and your board and your volunteers, by doing this program evaluation. Because you're going to be able to understand more about how the program works, and then you're going to be able to generate that support, either from your funders or your volunteers or your community. So really think about it that way. It's for you. It's not for other people necessarily. And as I was saying, there's a lot of different kinds of program evaluation. A lot of them are really fancy. A lot of them are really expensive and very comprehensive. They require a lot of time that you probably don't have, money that you probably don't have, and maybe it is required by another funder. But there are less fancy ways, and that's what I'm going to talk about, that you can do it. And the focus should be on what you can do and be very common sense about it. And I think that's something that people don't realize. It can be a very common sense thing. It doesn't need to be super complicated. So I'm going to take you through this common approach that we're using now and show you what it is, and then we can have some conversation about it. And the approach that we are currently using is called results accountability. Has anybody heard of this, results-based accountability? No? It's a model that's been put forth by Mark Friedman. I have a resource at the end of the presentation here so you can see that. And it's really just basically, it's common sense. It's common sense language and questions. And you answer the questions, you keep focused, and then you've sort of finished with your program evaluation. You don't need an outside person to help you do this. You don't need an expert to come in and give you these questions. And once you answer the questions, you will do a better job of maximizing the resources at your agency. You'll be able to really make a very powerful case about your organization or your program and what it is you're doing and the success you're having. You'll be able to justify the time that you put into it, the resources that you need for it, and all the other things that you want for your program. And it's also a really good planning tool. We kind of use this model outside of our program evaluation internally at our United Way, so we're evaluating ourselves, and it's very effective in that matter as well. Okay, so a lot of you, let's look at the questions here. The questions tell a story once you get it all the way through there, but the first three questions you probably answer all the time. Who does your program serve? So you know who you're serving. You hopefully know some pretty basic demographic or other types of characteristics about your clients, and you're able to talk to people about that probably very comfortably. You know what you need to do the work, if you need certain types of tools or personnel or facilities. I mean, you've got all of that kind of stuff. And you know how you're supposed to do it. You know what activities you need to actually supply on a regular basis to do the work. So that's easy. You can answer those questions. You can get people together in a room and write it down, and you've already got 3 of them, 3 of the 7. They're all answered. But the next part of it is where we get into sort of the performance measures. And that's where you have to think about, well, how much of that do you do? How well do you do it? And then in the end, is anybody better off? Who's better off? And actually, how do you know that they are better off? And so those questions are really appropriate for you to ask for any different part of your program or even overall in your agency. So I'll just give you an example about what types of things you can put in each one of these categories. So the how much, it's really outputs. And I think, the output measures are things that we're all pretty comfortable gathering. You probably all have this data somewhere in your organization. It's not going to be that hard for you to say, how much do you do? How many people did you serve? How many meals did you give out? How many classes did you have? Whatever it is, what's your activity and how many service offerings did you provide? Does everybody do that right now? You're all pretty... So you're nodding your heads. Okay. The second one is really how well did we do it? And there are multiple ways for you to think about answering this question. A simple way is to ask people who participate in your program, hey, how well are we doing this service or offering this service? And this gets back, though, to the first part of the first slide, is that you need to do it in a systematic way, and it needs to be a process. It's not an anecdotal conversation where you're talking to people and saying, well, this person said we were doing a really good job, so we must be doing a really good job. And I don't need to go ask anybody else. You want to make sure that you're asking people on a regular basis, and you're getting responses from a high majority of the program participants. A lot of programs have the benefits of some best practices that are out there in the community. So if you've got somebody else who's done all the research for you and they've come up with a best practice that says if you just do these things, then we know from the research that we've done that you're going to get this benefit, then you can start to employ that best practice. And that's always helpful. And that's good. Funders like to hear that as well, that you're using a best practice. You can also talk about the qualifications of your staff, if there's any particular type of training that is required, or if there's an exceptional level of training that staff have that you're able to talk about. This is all like how well we're doing things. And then if you're licensed, or if you have anybody who comes in to just externally review you. So for instance, some agencies that we fund say, well, the United Way comes in when they're talking to other funders, and we've done an external review of them, and this is sort of what the United Way said about us, because not everybody is licensed or accredited, and you need somebody else. Or if you have multiple partners you're working with to run your program, you can send them a survey and ask them how well you're working with them as a partner. So there's a number of ways to do it. But that's how you can kind of get at the how well question. And then lastly, is anybody better off? And those are things that are going to take you probably a little bit more time. But the idea is to try and figure out where you can demonstrate any changes in skills, any changes in knowledge or attitude, behaviors, circumstances, or well-being. Because that's really what we're all about trying to do. And you have multiple resources for getting this information. And I'm guessing that a lot of you have it already in your office, but you just don't realize it or access it or use it in a way that's helpful to you to do this program evaluation. But you have program records, you probably have participant surveys, you have external data. Any kind of form that you have somebody fill out is a source of information for you that you really need to be looking at what's on that form and figuring out if that's data that you can use to help you do your program evaluation. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Good. Now, as I said, it's probably kind of hard to figure out what you want to choose to measure, because you can sort of overwhelm yourself with data and make a big, long list of data, and that would probably not be a successful way to start or improve your program evaluation. And sometimes you have a funder who says, we want to know this, and so sometimes that's easy. They tell you that's what they want to know, and you have to figure out how to go get it. But really the best way is to find some data that's going to help you and your program staff decide how to run the program. That's the most useful information for you because you're going to use it. And that's what we want, is to have you using data and collecting data that's important for you. And the data should really be compelling. You should be able to get excited about it when you see changes that are good, be able to talk about it, and then get into a conversation with people and have that kind of a conversation. And it should be data that helps you make the case for investing in that work. It says, really, this is what tells us we know we're doing a good job. So you can sort of just ask yourself those questions. You get a piece of data and you sit down and you sort of ask these 3 questions, and then if you can't answer yes to them, then it might not be a really good or useful piece of data for you to consider collecting. So you don't want to get into that cycle of sort of wasting your time just gathering lots and lots of information that you're not going to use. So we would recommend, going back to that slide, just starting simply by picking, one thing to measure. One thing that you know that you can track over a period of time. Reliability of data is very, very important, that you know that you can get it, and it can be the same piece of information. It's much more useful that way. So you can look at those kinds of data and get some ideas. You probably have tools already, or maybe some other people have tools that they have used that they can share with you. I think that's one of the great things about sort of these networks is that we can bring people together and start to talk about tools or how they might have a participant survey that you could modify or something along those lines. Does anybody have an example of something that they could share? I mean, I'm sure you're all doing some kind of program evaluations. Is there anything somebody's currently doing they want to say it's working for you? No?
We recently had a study done by a UVM graduate student, which was really exciting because it was an external piece, and they found that we reduced hospitalization rates, emergency room visits, and decreased the length of stay when people are admitted to the hospital, which was really exciting data. And one of the reasons why I wanted to come today was because, I mean, that's really kind of big.
Right.
For a new program to be able to accomplish that, and it was really a marked decrease. It wasn't just like a little tiny percentage point. It was like significant. But I'm looking for other ideas of what other clinical outcomes we can be looking at and things like that we can do internally to sort of build on that finding.
Because that sounds like it would be a sort of a major outcome that you would want to be able to share with other funders, because there's probably a cost to that too. If you're reducing the length of stay and there's a cost reduction or a cost saving, that's part of that, which people would be very interested in hearing about. Yeah. Anybody else have an example? Oh, Nan has samples to share. Okay.
I have an example and then also a question.
Okay.
So one thing that when we do these events, the last event we did was out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and we handed out audience questionnaires. And one of the questions was, after viewing this program, and this was with Stanford Addison, the Northern Rafco horse gentler, that you would think about or do differently from this program. And a woman was visiting from Oklahoma, and she wrote that she would not be so afraid of people who looked or lived differently than she was used to. But I don't know, I hear what you're saying, so how do we I have a lot of sort of small anecdotal things, I did a project with the Sunnis, and Vermonters were really generous, and we sent over 2 cargo loads of art supplies, and then 2 years later I got this video thank you from these refugees in Kalkuma refugee camp, surrounded by all these art supplies that Vermonters had sent over thanking us. And it was very moving to sort of see this connection, but I don't always know how to use these sort of human connection stories or reaching out in a way.
They are hard to do, like in the first example, you're sort of asking people, and it's a standard question that you're asking people. How are you going to? I mean, that's a good question. How is this program going to sort of change if you go back to this? Is it going to change your behavior in any way? And this person said, yes, this is going to change my behavior, right? And so you could sort of take that information and you could look at all the other cards and say how many people said yes. It doesn't necessarily make a difference as to what they said, but the fact that they said they were going to change their behavior. And then get a sense of how many people got enough out of that presentation or event that they're going to do something different now. And then you can say, based on this, we feel like, we wish we had more people who said yes, or wish we had, you never want less people, but more people. And then the question is, are you able to somehow follow up with them later on? So we have a similar thing that we do in Chittenden County with the program we have in businesses, where we bring everybody to a training and we ask them that question: did you learn anything that you might take away right now? And then they say yes. And then hopefully, if it's possible, if you could follow up with those people 6 months later and say, did you actually do that? Have you implemented anything that you've learned at this event or this training? And what was it? And has it made a difference? That's sort of the next level of doing it. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes?
This might be slightly different, because as we're doing new program development, we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. We're doing more like satisfaction surveying of people receiving the service, And we just find SurveyMonkey really easy to use for people that have internet access. But so I guess that What we did last year when we did a program where we were delivering food to people in their work site was halfway through the season say, okay, so how's it going? How are you feeling about the quality, the value, that sort of thing. What program changes would you make? And then made some of those changes and then tested again at the end of the season. And that's just really helpful in terms of program development. It's not, but it's not exactly outcomes based, but it's still. I just wanted to throw it out there that I think it's really useful.
It is really useful, and that is a great way when you're doing the program development to sort of test those things as you go through. And I think it's important too when you're thinking about your program, you have to have in mind what the outcome is you're trying to achieve. So what's the end? Because that's what you really want to try and figure out and measure. So when you're doing your food program, is the end to make sure these people are getting a certain type of nutritional quality in their food, or is it they get food because they're not hungry, or what are the different levels of outcomes that you want, and then making sure that you're actually getting the data that tells you the answer to that question. And that's a tricky part, but you always need to be going back to what your program says it's going to be doing and asking the question that's going to. We've had people. And this is good. This is not a bad thing. This is a really good thing to have happen. But go through a whole program evaluation and then realize they were asking the wrong questions because they didn't get the answers to the ultimate question they wanted. But that's fine because then they just improve their program evaluation process. It's not an issue. They say, well, we weren't doing it the way we thought. We didn't get the data. It's not the result was bad or good because we actually don't know. So I think that is a good way to go about doing it. Excellent. So I can tell that you're all doing these things already anyway. So those are some examples. Right, choosing what to measure, just running it through. These are some simple questions, just making sure these can help you. Starting simply. I really would stress that. Start simply. Don't try and do too much because you're going to get yourself really frustrated. And and then you'll stop. And then we don't want that to happen. Okay, so you've gone through all the questions and you know who you're, this is a slide from a different presentation because it says, how do you use volunteers? This was specifically for a volunteer management program, Nan, but this particular one. Anyway, so who do you serve? What do you need? How do you do it? And you've answered the performance measurement questions of how much, how well, and is anybody better off? And then what you need to do is actually use the data. You need to figure out what you need to improve or strengthen so that you can, oops, that's not where I wanted to go. So you need to share the results, and you need to have conversations with people. You need to have conversations with your staff. You need to have conversations with your board, with your funders, so that you can, one, find out, is this the kind of information that's really useful and compelling to them? You've gone through a lot of effort to collect the data. You don't want it to just sit there. You've done it for a reason. And so it can be really helpful in marketing your program and generating other types of support. So I'm going to give you an example, just so you can sort of see. This might help you, Sid, because I think there's a Boys and Girls Club in this data set. But we have several youth development programs that we fund at the United Way. We work with them on a regular basis to help them answer these kinds of questions about how much, how well, and is anybody better off. And so, of course, in the first area, how much? Well, there's a lot of things they can tell us, but basically the number and the characteristics of the youth served. Because in the outcome that we're looking at a particular population of youth. A lot of them might be low income or at-risk youth. So, we sort of ask that kind of a question. And next, we'd ask how well. A lot of the youth development programs are licensed, or they're part of a national organization. Their staff are trained in a particular way. Some of them have quality ratings from the state of Vermont, so they can talk about that. Gives us a sense of how well they might be. And then is anybody better off? Well, the youth development programs in our area got together and decided they're all working on a certain set of outcomes for youth. And they really wanted to make sure that youth feel safe at the program, that youth are connected to caring adults and positive role models, and that they're connected to the community. And when I went back to the best practice question, there's a lot of data around youth development that says that it's really important for the youth development programs to make sure that the children are safe. Connection to a caring adult is one of the most important reasons why the kids will come back to the program. And so, you know, these are the things that the programs wanted to measure. So they ask these questions. They do it in a survey. They do a very systematic survey on a regular basis throughout the course of the year. So they're getting a series of surveys through all the youth that are coming through their programs. And for each one of these particular anyone better off questions, there's a subset of questions. So, you know, safe, for instance, they're going to ask people about being comfortable themselves at the club, if there's any bullying that they witness. So that, you know, there's sort of some questions that you can get at to say, yes, overall, the youth feel safe here, or overall the youth feel connected to a caring adult. There's a question about, you know, who do you talk to when you have a problem or you have a question? You know, who do you feel like you can go to? So those are the types of things that they're asking. And in that case, the programs individually have their own surveys, and they get their own data, and they can talk about the impact of their programs on the youth that come to their program. But for the United Way, we're able to take all that information because they are using a common survey that we've helped them develop, and then talk about it on a community level and say, in Burlington, for instance, we know that this percentage of the youth are feeling like they are safe or that they're getting the results that they need. And that's the difference between the program outcome and the community level outcomes. And that's work that we do a lot with the programs to sort of have that collective type of program measurement. And just to talk briefly about that, in case, because some of you are probably involved in collaborations, or there's been something that's going on in your community that they've identified an issue, and there's a lot of different strategies that are going on to try and address that one particular issue. Is that happening for any of you? No? Yes? Okay. Yeah.
Department of Health and
Right.
UVM Extension and the Community Cupboard and us, you know, we all are working on that general issue together.
You're all working on it together. You're all doing different things, but
Yeah.
somebody is probably going to at some point go, how are we actually going to measure the impact? And have you guys talked about what you might be doing to measure the impact of it? You have
Well, actually, we already started. We're pretty nascent. Started with the needs assessment,
Yeah.
then are building from there.
Okay, good. So that's good. But if, at some point, there'll be some sort of result or indicator in this sort of model that everybody's working towards. So there's an issue in the community, a piece of data in the community, you want to try and address it. And there's a bunch of different strategies that are taking place to address that particular issue. And each one of those strategies has its own performance measures, answering the questions of how much, how well, is anybody better off? And then also there's a community indicator that might have been identified that you would hope would, in this case, go down based on the individual program efforts that are taking place, right? This sort of model also takes into account that there are other influences that nobody has control over. The economic downturn, right? So those are the types of things where you would look at your data and say, everything else is working well, but this is something that's out of our control. So, you know, we need to account for the fact if the data doesn't look the way we expected it to. So this is when you're doing it on that bigger community level. And the example that I'll give you is an example in Burlington. We were talking about the North earlier, and I was like, oh, here I am coming to Burlington. But we had a problem in Burlington. We had the highest dropout rate in Vermont in the Burlington High School. And there was a response. There was a task force that came together, and it convened to address the school's dropout rates. And there were a lot of partners. There were a lot of strategies that were involved in addressing this dropout rate. And it included nonprofit providers, the school, the police, the courts, the juvenile court judges, state's attorneys. I mean, you name it. There was a lot of stuff going on with this project. It was very big. But the goal was dropout rate, right? So certain things had happened. The school district instituted a new truancy policy. And for each one of these strategies, like I said, there was their own individual performance measures. So the school district was able to talk about what that policy did for their school. The juvenile court started cooperating with the state's attorneys, and actually they would hear the truancy cases when they were filed. So there was a time put aside on the court docket to hear those cases. And then the Vermont state agencies were helping to provide services to all the truant students to remove barriers to school attendance. And there was some research that was done about why kids weren't going to school in the first place. So all these things are happening in the community. It's happening over the course of several years, actually. And in the end, you could see from this lovely little chart that the dropout rate, where'd the little line go? In 1999, it was up about 10%, and now it's dropped to about 3%. And this is a continuing effort. So this is one of those things where, in order to keep that percentage low, the Truancy Project, as it's called, still continues to meet. It's grown beyond Burlington, so it's expanded into other communities and other school districts. But the idea is that they're staying together and they're measuring things all along, and they're keeping this particular indicator as their headline top indicator to measure the success that they're having. And you can also, there's a lot more data we could talk about here. This means this many more children, 60 more kids graduated from high school during this year, and then you can create all sorts of economic impact and other types of social impact by having that information. You couldn't say that before you had this data. Okay, so you've gone through everything, and you want to make it all fit together. Because really the big part of doing this is being able to make your case and talk about how well you're doing your program. So I just want to, make sure that you put the whole story together so that you can talk to your funders about the great work that you're doing. You're going to have challenges doing this. We have challenges doing this. There's no way to do it without challenges. And one of the challenges is you might get sidetracked into doing something else, anything else, because you really don't like this. And it can be hard, and it does require a commitment and a focus, and it's something that you have to set aside time and be very sort of disciplined about doing it. I am going to add this type of work to my regular meetings with my staff or my regular meetings with my board, or I'm going to set up a specific committee to do this. There are things that you need to do to make sure it's sort of like hits you all the time. Oh, right, I need to be doing this work. Definitely, there's always that trick with assuming appropriate accountability and making sure that you're not trying to measure something that you do not have influence over. That issue I talked about earlier between the program part and the community part. You want to make sure that you're not saying we're going to change this massive condition in the community when you, on your own, whatever size program you have, it really just doesn't have the power to do that. It will be hard to find or use some measures. That's always a challenge. You need to kind of be creative, have conversation, and just sort of do a lot of brainstorming around that. My guess is that you probably have a lot of this data already in your office someplace. It's in a file. It's on a piece of paper. It's in somebody's computer. You probably have a lot of it. You just need to think about where it is and how you can pull it together in an effective way. And that's sort of those bottom 2 points. But then also it's committing that resource. We're all extremely busy. You're really busy. You're doing this work. You're talking to people every day. You're providing your services every day. Where do you find the time to do it? And that, I know, is a challenge. I know when people have overcome it, they've found it very rewarding. You're able to get some great results, and you go, wow, it really is awesome what we're doing. So, and that's empowering. So when you're able to get that good result, you'll feel good about it, and you'll want to do more. Using data effectively and using data at all, there's always that challenge. And we hear it from people. They don't like data. They don't trust data. And we're not trying to say be entirely data-driven and only look at your data and only use data. The work that we're in is definitely a sort of a combination of those things, right? You need data and you need the human piece of it too. So you need to find that good balance. But you do need to use it effectively by being careful about the measures that you're choosing and sharing, but do make sure you use them. So just some advice. I would definitely follow that question, that 7-question format. You don't need to do more than that. Or you could go find something else that works for you. Like I said, if results accountability doesn't seem like it would work for you, there are a lot of other resources out there, and you can go to Nonprofit Vermont and find some. You get assistance from your staff and volunteers. You probably have a lot of good resources there. Or you can find it from other funders, from colleges, students. Like I said, make it a regular topic for your staff and board meetings. Share your ideas and use your data. And just so you know, just some acknowledgments that our work has been funded also by the Henderson Foundation. They're very generous in supporting us. And the RBA stuff is all on the website. It's all on the internet. Fiscal Policy Studies, Mark Friedman, and there's a couple of books and a few websites there. So
Mark Friedman is sort of a big name in outcomes measurement.
he's a big name, yeah. He's been in Vermont. He's helped a lot of people in Vermont do work. So he comes by occasionally. He hasn't been here in a while, but there are people who are trained in that model in Vermont, and so there are consultants that can be found.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Thanks.
So Nan has some examples for us that she's going to share from her work, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. There's advantages and disadvantages to going last. You know, the bad part is nobody's fresh still. So if people need to get up and move around, I'm perfectly fine with that because I'm the same way. I can't sit for that long. But the good thing is I know some of the things you've talked about, and I can pull from that and look like I'm really clever and that I had all this advanced knowledge. What I want to chat with you about is coming from the perspective of an agency that has to do what you're looking at doing. I direct RSVP, and for those of you that don't know what we do, RSVP engages volunteers in providing community service throughout the country. There's actually 750 throughout the country. We're actually part of the Corporation for National Community Service. I direct not only RSVP, but Foster Grandparents, which is another Senior Corps program that also provides volunteers. And one of the things that for RSVP, just to give you a little play on how this all started for us, it started back in 1995, and what they were calling it then was impact programming. And you'll come across 50 different ways to label this and 50 different models, and what you need to do is pick out what is going to work best for your situation. I did bring along some examples of just a little bit of research that I did on different types of models that you might find useful, and I also brought along some samples of some impact work plans that we use for different projects that we do. In addition to providing volunteers, the other thing that RSVP has started to do in the last 10 years is do something that we call signature programs, which is essentially direct service programs, which we never did in the past. And what we do is we utilize volunteers to deliver it. Some of you may be familiar with Bone Builders, which is a strength training program for seniors. That's one of our signature programs. We have another one called Telecare, which is a safety check-in and telephone reassurance program. There's a lot of transportation programs in the state. RSVP runs some of those. Those are the kinds of programs that RSVP began to look at as a way to measure impact. The bottom line is it comes down to funding. No matter what people tell you, the reason why you have to do it is really for money. We were directed to do it from the feds because they were saying we need to justify to the legislature when we go to them for money what you're using taxpayer dollars for. So, and that's understandable, but I'm here to tell you that's what the reason is. We all know we're doing good work, and anecdotally, as you pointed out, we can all talk about the great work that we do, but it's about funding. And I think there are some challenges I want to quickly mention around that. I think that one of the challenges to funders that I would say, so it's kind of interesting that Community Foundation is here today, is that when you're looking at outcomes and measurements, the example that you gave, Sarah, is one of those ones where we're in danger of losing those because of the need to provide the data-oriented outcomes. So whenever I talk to funders about this, I always say to them, please don't lose track of those stories and how important they are. Sometimes the fancy reports are the ones that catch the eyes of funders. So as much as you can put those together, you should do that. But don't lose that balance that Monica mentioned of retaining the common sense things that you know you provide and how important they are to the community. Because the reality is there are local funders that want to hear those stories. And that's one of the things we've discovered. The local contributor, the individual person you solicit, the local businesses, they want to know those stories as much as they want to know the data. It's interesting that the pendulum, we were talking about this earlier, swings in that direction of all people want is data and numbers and outcomes. But it's starting to settle down a little bit now and get back towards the middle. And one of the things we're hearing is, okay, enough about numbers. Now I want you to tell me firsthand, actually United Way is a good example. When we do our allocation presentation, we often have one of the clients, if you will, or service recipients come and talk about what it means. Because the individual citizens that sit on that allocation committee, that's who they want to hear from. I can give them all the numbers I want. So I always think that there's a little bit of a danger in these kinds of things, and you have to really temper what you report with staying in touch with all those beautiful stories, like you said. For me, if I were a funder, and I do read grants, I look at those stories. I think they're critically important. But maybe that's because I'm in the business, too, and I see every day the difference it makes. But the bottom line is there's no doubt in my mind that you do have portions of your program that you can do this kind of thing with, that you can do measuring with. And because that's what funders want, you need to be able to provide it, and that's the bottom line. So one of the things I've given you are some samples of how we do it. We have some programs that lend themselves to it really well. Bone Builders is a perfect example. We can measure bone density. We know how people are improving their strength. We can do great measurable outcomes in that. So we emphasize that one a lot. But we have another program called Operation Dolls and More, which has just grown unbelievably. And at Christmas time, we have volunteers that I can't think of the word right now. I can never remember this word. It's like when they redo dolls. Refurbish. That's not even the word, but it'll come to me. But anyway, they take a doll and they basically completely restore it. And they also, now they do accessories with it. And now we do books and we do bicycles. And it's just grown tremendously in 5 years. And we have this huge program. And at Christmas, we have about 50 different organizations that now come and take these items back. And then they distribute it to needy kids. And the kinds of stories we get back are fairly anecdotal. We know how many items we give out. But do we know whether giving that child that item has, changed their poverty status? Well, no. So from the federal perspective, they don't even want to hear about that program from us. But locally, it's probably one of the most popular programs we do. Local funders want to hear about it all the time. We get more volunteers for that program than any other program we do. So it's one of those things that I will say to you again, don't let go of those programs that you may not be able to measure in the traditional way because they're just as valuable. And maybe the key is to try and figure out a way to report it. And I wish there were a way to come up with some anecdotal reporting capacity that would get at things that you can't get from data. But that's a dilemma, and maybe that's a challenge for all of us to come up with because Vermont's very cutting edge, and we see that when we go around the country. The stuff that we're doing here is always, people are like, wow, So I would think that's an interesting challenge that we could look at because I think we're a state that really does very well with that kind of thing, and I would hate to see us lose that. One of the biggest things that's going on now is that state funding is very tight for nonprofits, as you all know. We were facing our foster grandparent program was about to dissolve, and we were really glad, I must tell you, to have really impactful, powerful knowledge to share with the legislators. And so once again, when it comes to funding, that's the kind of stuff they want to know. Now, to be honest, the Operation Dolls and More program wouldn't have made a bit of difference to them, but the Bone Builders program did, because the bottom line is they've got a lot to handle and a lot of information to sort through, and they aren't going to be able to read that kind of anecdotal stuff. So you've got to be able to present your statistics at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a time and place to do that. I think you mentioned a legislator day. That's a perfect opportunity to bring legislators or funders to your project and share those wonderful stories that you talked about and that you mentioned, Audrey. You made that comment about money, and I just thought right off the bat when you introduced yourself, I thought, man, she's figured that one out, because truthfully, that really is what it's about. But yeah, be glad in some respects, because it really is a challenge. But we have another program where we have volunteers that work with Vermont Teddy Bear to provide stuffed teddy bears to children who are victims of abuse. Well, I can't, and I have yet to figure out a way to measure the degree of comfort that that provides. And so how do we report that? It really is a challenge. So what type of outcomes can we achieve in that kind of a situation, or can it really be measured? Probably not, but what you can do is at least report the numbers. And you can, in a narrative format at least, talk a little bit about what it does. And there may be services you provide that fit into that category. And once again, I want to encourage you to be sure and include that along with your other statistical data, because everybody reading those is touched in a different way. And just as often as you will have funders that need that statistical stuff, you will have grant readers who want to hear that aspect of it too. Nothing bores me more as a grant reader than just reading all about numbers. There are some people that are perfectly satisfied with that. I'm not. I need to know more about what you're doing from a narrative perspective. So I guess what my biggest message to you is to include both, and don't lose those. Yes?
With the teddy bear example, I'm thinking somebody out there somewhere may have done an actual study of the quantifiable results of comfort, some psychological psychology graduate student or whatever. And if you could find those reports and distill something out of those, would that be helpful to include?
Yeah, you could probably reference a study that shows that these provide such and such. Absolutely, I would encourage you to cite that. But you actually end up touching on another tough issue, and that is staff time and staff expertise in putting together this information. There's a lot of people like Mark Friedman's of the world that are experts at putting together outcomes, but we have limited staffs, all of us do, and limited money.
That's a lot of my good stuff comes from volunteers.
Yeah.
Far more skilled.
And that's a whole other subject. We do volunteer management forums and come and,
Right.
put it on our thing. We did our third, fourth series.
I could never afford the caliber of people who volunteer for me for a pet.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and they are the ones who write
Yeah.
the grants.
But coming up with and doing the research to do that, that's a lot of time and effort. And it's not, you touched on that, Monica, and you cannot discount how important that is. And I think that could and should be included in your funding requests, that you want to provide really good, outcomes, whatever the word is that you want to use. And so, include that in when you're requesting funding.
I have a couple of questions.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Me. You mentioned that you're a grant reader, and you say to put in these stories, these testimonials of, knowing the impact of the dolls or the impact of the teddy bears. With the grants that we're writing, we have been self-sustained up until the last few years, and this nervousness is forcing us to go and get grants. There isn't the opportunity. You are given a set...
Especially online grants, you're right.
You are given a set number of questions. You are given only so many characters. It's very difficult.
It is.
I break out in hives. To tell you the truth, don't publicize that on TV. Somebody says grant around me, because... And then I have to write a letter, an executive director's letter. You look at samples, you look at this. You don't get a chance to tell them your bleeding heart story.
Some of them, more and more of them that I'm coming across, are allowing for attachments. So you can sometimes put attachments on. And I would tell you, send it via snail mail anyway, even if they tell you that. And you can say that in your grant. There's going to be a sentence where you can say, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that you actually hear about what we've done. So I'm going to be forwarding you, because I really believe that there are grant readers out there that would respond to that.
I did an economic impact study just on the effects of if our business went out, how it would affect our community, and it's quite severe.
So they're different, and they're also, keep in mind, there are different parts in a grant application where you can put information. So there's always a needs statement. So
Yeah, but there's not enough room. I know what she's talking about.
Right, I understand, but there are places that you can tie in some of the data. Simply, you can refer to the whole report, but you can say this needs statement says X, Y, Z. And then you also have the what difference are you going to make question, which they always ask, and it's not just the output, right? It's not just the units. I think that's the point here. It's the difference that's made. So you've got a place to actually put output and outcome in those proposals.
And you can elaborate there's usually a community needs section, and that's a good place to actually put some of that information, because if you're able to show the community need through a narrative, you can weave that into the community needs section. That's where we put a lot of that kind of information.
There's another question.
The Vermont Arts Council has access to this article about measuring joy, about an article about a group in Philadelphia, I think, that runs a pottery studio, and they had to quantify, and they were like, how do you measure joy, or how do you measure some of the impacts of arts? So that's a good resource.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Those are the kinds of things, and I think we're going to start seeing more and more of those. I think one of the things people sometimes ask themselves, and I'll give you a good example. We have a literacy program. We have volunteers that go into the program. A lot of folks are familiar with America Reads, but we have America Reads volunteers. So we have people that go into the classrooms and they do classroom reading once a week with students. And it's partly to kind of enhance the joy of reading and to have somebody come in that isn't a teacher but is really a lay person that's going to help them learn to love reading. And it's also an older person, so it has that intergenerational piece. Well, there's no way that we can claim that if the reading scores go up in that classroom, it's because that one person comes in once a week. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that we're part of that team of people that are promoting literacy. And so I think some of it has to do with wording and the way you tweak your report. So what we would do is the teachers will report to us, yes, we have an increase in the number of students that are meeting our literacy goals at the end of the year. And what we say is, we believe our America Reads people, and from the teacher's perspective, they believe that they are contributing to an improvement in the reading. So you don't always have to be the sole reason why something has happened. I mean, nutrition's a perfect example. If you're contributing to it, I think most funders would agree that that's a perfectly reasonable and acceptable outcome. I think a lot of us get caught up in thinking that we have to be the whole reason why something wonderful happens, and you don't. That's where these collaborations really come into play, where if you're part of a nutrition coalition or you're part of a literacy coalition or whatever it might be, housing, if you're one of the contributing members, that's a great way to do it. And I will tell you, funders love collaboration for obvious reasons, because it's a great way to deliver service. So the more you can talk about the collaborative efforts that you have within your outcomes, and when you're listing your activities, the better it is. It's another good thing. And, of course, as a volunteer management organization, I can't encourage you enough to talk about volunteers and the role that they play in what you're able to accomplish. And I would just, as an aside, mention to you, they're also a match. They represent a fiscal match and a financial match. And a lot of people don't think about that. We just got the newest independent sector figure, and it's $19.84 an hour is the value of a volunteer hour of service. And the reason for that is because of what it would cost you to employ somebody. It's not simply the wage, it's everything else that goes into supporting an employee. That's a lot of money, and that's a perfectly legitimate figure to use. Just go to independentsector.org, and it has tons of information for independentsector.org has tons of information about your volunteers and what they provide for you financially. And when you're doing your match money, which for many funders does not have to be just cash, they're perfectly fine if it's in-kind. Volunteers represent a strong in-kind match. Plus, they're ambassadors for you in the community. Don't hesitate to use your volunteers for that purpose as well. They'll recruit other people to help you, and in many cases, they can help you even with your outcome pieces and helping put together what you're going to do with that, because they're the ones out there in the community doing it. The newest thing that we're seeing from an outcome perspective is around the state of Vermont are evidence-based programs. You've probably heard that word a lot. That's like taking measurement to a whole new level, and you'll probably hit that too at some point. And we have people saying, good Lord, where will it end? Because evidence-based is really intense. It's very university, research-based, and they're looking for real specific. So when you see evidence-based programs that you can participate in, perhaps as a collaborator, that's a really good idea, because they're very cutting edge right now, and if you can get involved in that, it's a really nice way to tag on to some of the programs. The blueprint for the governor's blueprint for health initiatives that are going on around the state are all evidence-based programs, and those are really hot items right now. So if you can get involved in those, I would encourage you to do that. Not because you want to run one, because that's frightening, but because you might want to participate in one. I'm sure you've heard lots about those.
You're totally right. Yeah, I mean, trying to find where they are and what they are, because they're hidden. I mean, they're out there, but they're hidden.
Well, and the intense level of what the expectations are is pretty scary. But once again, if you can be a partner with somebody that's in it, it would be great to be able to affiliate with that, because from a funding perspective, to be able to designate that you're participating in one would go a long way with getting you some additional funds, which is really what we're all about.
This might be a hard question, but if just as for a ballpark figure, if you have your X amount of resources at your disposal, what percentage of that should be devoted to reporting and accounting for what you do? I mean, if you're gonna, is it like you do spend 80% of your time doing things and 20% working on it, reporting on it, or is there any rule of thumb?
I don't know of one, to be honest. I think it changes depending on what your funding needs are. There are some people that have such a steady stream of support and funding support, they probably don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But essentially, the more grants you write, the more you're going to have to spend time doing it, and either devote administrative time to it or staff time. I mean, a number of organizations have grant writers or grant committees, and one way to do that is to use volunteers for that. If you have advisory boards or boards of directors, you can develop an arm of that group to help with that specifically. Believe it or not, there are people very much that enjoy doing that. I know that's hard to believe, but there truly are people that like to do that, because it's very, like accountants like that, because it's very precise, and so if you know people in the community that you can tap in to do that, that's a great way to do it without spending a huge amount of staff time and effort on it. Sooner or later, it's going to fall back to staff to some degree anyway, but I think that's another wonderful way to utilize volunteers. But I wish I could give you that.
I think it's important to think about it as part of a cycle, right? So it's not like you're just like, oh, now's the time we have to do our evaluations, right? You really need to think about it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with just like that plan, do, check, act cycle. It's pretty basic, but you're going to plan your activity, you're going to run your program, you're going to check it, and you're going to adjust it. And you should have that cycle and know what that cycle is, and then you build in the time. And so it's like it's a behavioral change internally for you all as well. You have to think about doing your work a little bit differently. And then you'll figure out how much time it's going to take, and it'll take a lot of time when you're first starting it out, and then as you get into a cycle, if you make it a process, you're systematized, it might not be as much time. And I totally agree with what Dan said. You wouldn't believe, there's a group of volunteers that our executive director fondly refers to as the Geek Squad, because there are people who love this stuff who do it for us at the United Way. You can find them.
And it can be done. It's taken us many, many years, and there's times when it's tedious and you just want to say, oh, gosh, this is terrible. And there's times when you're going to feel like it's almost diminishing the natural value of what you do. But you just need to collect yourself and say, but this is the way I'm going to bring resources and money in, and this is the way I can report in a compact, sensible way to the community. And then you just sort of collect yourself and move on, the way we all do when we face these kinds of challenges in the nonprofit world. But it really does work. And you know what? You can always call us and vent. You can call me. I have my business card back there. Call me. I do that kind of thing all the time. And I do have that back there. And I have some of our signature program brochures, because I think those are ways you can see that we've targeted into components. There's ways to break out your services into components that are each reportable in their own unique way. And if I can help in any way, or if you just need somebody to bounce things off of, we started doing it about 15 years ago, and we're still evolving. So that's part of what I do and provide as a person that works in that field. So don't hesitate to call me if you want to chat about it.
And I think that the big change for people like us is we're always in the do mode. There's the plan, do, check, act. We're always in do.
Yep. Yeah,
and
you're
so
right.
What you're suggesting is a kind of reflection that the planning and the checking and the revising, it's just not in our nature. So it is a big
It's hard to do.
change.
I don't say that lightly, because I understand how difficult it is. We do it in our office, and it's taking us a while, but it really works.
So are there other questions for Nan, or final comments you'd like to make?
I would just say there are lots of models out there. The United Way one is awesome. It's one that we've used off and on. But there are other ones that may fit better for you. So I've referenced a couple of those in the comment sheets I gave you. And if you do a Google search for outcome measurement, it's scary how many things you will come up with. And so don't be overwhelmed by that, because there are a couple that might just work really well for you. And as long as you've figured out a way to report it in a way that makes sense and will enhance your fundraising capacity, grab it.
So this is, thank you so much for giving us an introduction to the iceberg. We've looked at the top of it, and there's more underneath, but hopefully this has given you an idea of a framework for thinking through this, and pointed us towards some resources that there are. I think the work of Mark Friedman is really important. I think if you do a search, as Nan suggested, in outcomes for nonprofits, there's some really good resources that pop up right on the top. And then, of course, there are places such as Third Sector New England and the independent sector that there are just really helpful resources. And then, of course, if you find resources that are useful and you think they're great for the rest of the community, be sure to tag them on Delicious and put NPVT on them, so that we can, when we start to do our searches on the subjects on the Common Good Hub, we can start to find these things, and they're vetted resources. So thank you so much. Just draw your attention to the training schedule for the spring 2010. There are some webinars coming up on strategic planning and succession planning, and also there are more roadshows. We're doing 7 more around the state. You might find the topics interesting, and certainly we'll be recording most of them, so you'll be able to watch them online. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll participate in more events as we go forward. But of course, this work would be nothing without the work that we're all doing together, because it is a network of trying to make the state a better place. So thank you so much. Thanks a lot.